Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
A collaboration between A Good Night Out and the Arts Working Group at The World Transformed. In both groups, there have been countless discussions centered around what our utopia is that we want to fight for, and in wanting to cement these discussions around specific topics in order to create an understanding of the principles and practicalities of these spaces and the potential of self-organizing for communities to create their own power. Last week, some of you might have attended the Art Strategy Day that TWT hosted. And if you didn't get a chance to watch the sessions, we would really recommend watching the recordings, as we had some incredible speakers, and which we'll post the links to in the chat now. In one of the discussions around building arts and utopia, Rhiannon White, a community theatre director, referring to DIY culture, proposed the question, what is an unrecognized utopia? And this is a central idea that we want to think about today. In these highly precarious and fearful times, where congregation is limited and community has to be transformed across screens, we want to frame community DIY centres as these utopias of the unrecognisable.
We understand culture as everything and as ordinary, something central to our socialist vision of the world. As some of us here will be workers in the arts and culture sector, today we want to reflect on how we can form spaces of value in our creative work. So we're interested in the way that community DIY centres produce many different meaningful experiences and community services, from community theatre to recording studios, food banks to sites for local activism. These spaces are a crucial part of what we think about as working class infrastructures and culture determined and built by the grassroots. They're also the spaces where the relationships form, collaborations blossom, and our everyday utopias and the truest form of culture emerges.
Today, we're really lucky to be hearing from three amazing and very different projects, some existing and some sadly we will be referring to in the past tense. From these projects, we hope to learn about the difficulties, but also the amazing potential of these spaces that are constantly under attack from the neoliberalisation of space and the attempted dismantling of community and DIY culture. We hope today will invigorate conversations about what is our collective vision of a thriving socialist culture and how this is manifested in these spaces. We hope people also feel comfortable in sharing their own stories of community centres that have meant a lot to them, or ones that have been giving inspiration and spark discussion of how we can defend and preserve these spaces. So just to run down the structure, we're going to have three speakers who represent a specific community space in the UK for about 10 minutes each, and then we're going to have a short Q&A. So if anyone has any questions throughout, just post them in the chat and we'll have time to pick a few.
So without further ado, we are going to go to our first speaker. We are absolutely delighted to have Joanna Resnick, the company producer at Slunglow, who are a theatre company based in Leeds, and hopefully you managed to catch their short film suggested in the reading material. We asked Joanna today to introduce her work with Slunglow and the story of the Holbeck and how they managed to build trust in the community. Is Joanna there?
I am, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. Can you all hear me all right? Great. I'm the producer for a theatre company based in South Leeds, Slunglow, and we've been based in Holbeck for about a decade now. The company has been going much earlier than that, making theatre in all sorts of different spaces, but we're most well known for making large-scale people's theatre work, which combines a professional team of some core artists, creative team members and actors with the enthusiasm of a community in which we work to create pieces that we otherwise might not be able to. And most of our work is in non-traditional theatre spaces. So we've made work on boats, on trains, in city squares, in car parks, that sort of thing. And as I said, we've been based in South Leeds for about 10 years or so. I see questions coming in already, but I'll ignore those for the moment. I'll carry on. We had a 5 railway arches where we used to invite other artists to come and make work. And over time that developed. So basically we got that space because our funders said we have to stop working out of our director's kitchen if we wanted to be taken seriously and receive receive any more funding in the future. So we thought, well, what's the most useful response to that? Rather than a swish office in the centre of town for the same money, we've got these arches which provide a lot more space that we could do kind of messy creative work, invite other people in. And over time that developed. So we started hosting performance. So artists from around the country and international artists would come and perform on a pay what you decide basis. So the members of our community could come, take a risk on whatever it was coming through their door, and all of that money went directly to the artists who were visiting for that performance. And then in time we launched what we call the Cultural Community College, which is a program of adult cultural education which takes culture really broadly, everything from sword fighting to stargazing to South Indian cooking to fire eating, and the idea being that we were really keen to encourage learning for the sake of learning outside of outside of sort of formal education or in-work learning, something, and as an experiment to sort of see what that did to the individual members of our community and also us as a community as a whole. So we're sort of 2 years into that, and in the last, I'm here today to talk about the Holbeck space. So about 18 months ago, we moved into the oldest working men's club in the country, the Holbeck, which is only a few hundred meters down the road, but in a very different location to where we had been based. Our 5 railway arches kind of straddled the two communities of Holbeck, kind of the Holbeck proper, as it were, and then the urban village where all of the regeneration was happening. And so we kind of sat in the middle in this unusual wasteland, and there were lots of reasons which provoked our move into this space. Some of it was we saw that regeneration was approaching, and we knew that our time there was limited, that because of the nature of our location, we sit just outside of but very close to the Leeds managed sex worker area, which means that a lot of members of our community were nervous about walking to find us for their work, for a workshop or a performance, and at the same time we had been starting to use the Holbeck space more regularly for performance, for rehearsals, and getting to know members of that community who were in the last couple of months much more vocal about the challenges that they were facing there. So obviously this club has been going since 1877, but in the last sort of decade or so they'd got into financial difficulty, and about 5 years ago a sort of a local church group got involved in the making of sort of bringing the space back and retaining it for the benefit of the wider community. And so they worked as volunteers for the last sort of 5 years or so, running the bar, bringing the space up, and sort of protecting it for everyone who were members at the time, which was a massive undertaking. And their membership was getting older, and by their own admission they were getting kind of tired managing the space, and they were still in a fair bit of debt. And we were also at the same time, as I say, looking for a space of our own to kind of expand as our work was growing, and we wanted to be more embedded in the community in Holbeck. And so it felt like a win-win situation when we came together. So there were lots of meetings back and forth about what that might mean. So we basically were able to pay off the debts of the club and now manage the space day to day on behalf of the members and the wider community. And it's been an interesting 18 months, as I say. It's really transformed how Slunglow's relationship to the community and how useful we are, and how people engage with us day to day. And so I suppose it's what's interesting about the question about coming into a space and winning trust was the kind of the original provocation. What's interesting was with our work previously, we were doing shows often in cities around the country, and a lot of time having to convince people to trust us, to either come on board and take part in something that was a little unusual as a show, or as a performer or as an audience member, whereas this was a real transition because there isn't an end, and it goes back to that sort of question of maintaining things, which is a different one for us. We've obviously, where we were doing projects before, we could just keep going, power through to the end, and it was you'd have an endpoint with which you could kind of pause, take a beat, and then kind of catch up. So if you got everyone, if you kind of gathered people with you to that point, it felt like a win. Whereas now, as I say, it's constantly evolving and changing. So in the last few months, we alongside our other activity, obviously, we kind of paused some of the performance early on in lockdown, and quickly became drivers for the local food bank and the Meals on Wheels, and then became the ward lead for social care referrals in our community of Holbeck and Beeston, which is about 7,500 households. And that alone, that as an example is even quite decisive in our community. There were members who were unhappy that it was damaging the reputation of the club, and on the other hand, there were members who were sort of delighted that we were stepping in and supporting those people, and pleased that we were taking that on where others had to shield and couldn't work. And so I suppose what we've noticed is we've had to shift our mindset. So whereas before, when we did a project such as Flood, which was our show for Hull City for Culture, we were going to be there for 9 months in one residential area where we were going to make these 3 pieces of work, and that had been the largest time that we'd been outside of Leeds in another community, and we knew we had to win them over quite early on. Otherwise, those 9 months were going to be a nightmare. and so really early on, we were sort of in local resident meetings and sort of coming and basically sort of standing there in the room answering all of the questions that we had until there were no more questions. That's sort of had been our practice beforehand. So we would keep going until there wasn't until we'd answered all the questions or tried to alleviate any of the concerns or sort of issues of the time, and hopefully bring as many people along with us. Here in the Holbeck now, obviously things are constantly changing. These are very uncertain times. I think it was a mind shift change for us, where we realised, as much as we tried to say yes to everything early on and sort of prove we are going to stick to what we said we would do, because a lot of people at the time, I think, were a bit dubious. Holbeck's a place where a lot of things are done to it, and so they're sort of not quite used to people holding to their word. And so we thought, 18 months in, by this point, we'll have got them, they're with us, and that's not always the case. And it's a constant kind of calibration within each other and with all of the members. And so I feel like I'm talking quite a lot. I probably should move on to the next person. And I've seen there's lots of questions that have come in. So shall I start to answer any of those, or should we move on and come back to those at the end? What would you rather?
Let's move on to the next one, and then we'll come back in a bit for the little Q&A section.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you. That was brilliant. That was a really interesting, amazing insight into Slung Low and your evolving relationship with Holbeck and your community. I particularly liked the Cultural Community College, not just because I like a good alliteration, but also because I just love how embedded that is in that community. That's amazing. Next up, we have Emma Warren, who is a writer and DJ and is the author of Make Some Space, which is the text from which we had extracted some quotes for the reading. Emma has also just released a pamphlet titled Document Your Culture, which I think comes out is shipping tomorrow, in which she offers a practical guide of how to preserve community spaces. And we've just posted that link in the chat. Today, Emma is going to talk to us about the story of Total Refreshment Centre, or TRC, which is a DIY space in East London that was a hub for London's thriving jazz scene. Sadly, we talk about Total Refreshment Centre in the past tense, and so in view of this, we've asked Emma to reflect on what it means to witness the loss of a space, and also to question whether we should be trying to recreate the same spaces again and again.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for asking me. I really appreciate and value the work that you're all doing and the community which all of you who've come in to listen to this are part of. I think it's really important and valuable. and I'm grateful to be included. Also, really fascinating to hear about the Holbeck. What an amazing place. When I watched the video about the story of the place, I was really struck by a moment where someone was reading from a history book about Morecambe and Wise, and it transpires that this place was also one of the most important places on the comedy circuit, I'm guessing in the 70s or 80s. So whilst it's a place which has a kind of like current meaning in the community, it's also a place which is culturally important. And I suppose the fact that I noticed that is because that's the thing I'm interested in, is how we use stories to protect spaces that we love, to advocate for space, and to use kind of the very human thing of telling a story as a kind of act of resistance. So I wrote and published a book last year called Make Some Space. I've got a copy here, which looks like that, about Total Refreshment Centre. I didn't mean to write a book. It started out, it was going to be like a little fanzine, just a few interviews of some of the people who were involved there. And then for various reasons, mostly because it was being shut down, I ended up kind of going into overdrive, and I had this really strong feeling of the fact that this story could protect the place, because I knew it was valuable and I knew it was important. And I also knew, much like many of you will know, that it's kind of hard to explain why our spaces matter. We just go, oh, but they're really important, or they're really amazing, or they do this, or they do that. And the forces behind austerity and gentrification don't care about our spaces anyway. They have vested interests in not caring about them. But I feel like one of the ways we can begin to advocate for them is to explain them better. And that begins by being able to explain to ourselves why they're important. So Total Refreshment Centre, kind of ad hoc music venue, creative space that for about 6 years between about 2012 and 2018 ended up being a place where musicians and other artists could go and just kind of do their thing, play, be in each other's bands, just mess about in the most useful way possible. And that time ended up contributing hugely to a generation of musicians who pre-COVID were traveling the world, all over magazine covers, all over everywhere. Just it contributed to the culture in a really distinct and specific way. Before that, it was a Caribbean community centre, so it had a pre-history, and before that it was a chocolate factory, so again it had a pre-history, and for me being able to tell the stories of that pre-history helped explain why this particular place was important. And then the thing that I've just done now, Document Your Culture, a manual, I've done because I feel like more of us should be telling our own cultural stories. I agree with you that our definitions of culture have kind of got too small. Culture is just the material of our lives. It's what we eat, it's what's in our fridge, it's how we cook it, it's the pans we use, it's where those pans come from and what they tell us. It's about our clothing, it's about the things we're involved with, it's about the arts or music or creativity that's every day and in our extended families. It's not just high culture, it's not just opera and ballet. And I feel like we should be treating places like the Holbeck and Total Refreshment Centre and Mellow Mix and Blend, which was the Caribbean social community centre, social club that was there before, in the same way that people treat ballet and opera, as intrinsically valuable and intrinsically important. No one questions why opera and ballet get a load of funding. It's intrinsically valuable. Well, I feel like we could be using some of those arguments and using them against the people who would try and remove even more of our civic space from us. So you're asking me about these questions about will something like this happen again? Yes. Shall we try and replicate it? No, because you can't replicate it. All you can do is take the material you have around you and work with it collectively until it becomes something. So I hear in your community you talking a lot about DIY culture. And I would say DIY culture is plural, not singular. It's do it yourselves. It's not do it yourself. And I think DIY culture as a phrase sometimes seems only to relate to certain people doing certain things. And I think the more we talk about kind of, civic culture, civic space, no one's really excluded from that. No one would kind of go, oh, that's not really my kind of thing. DIY culture, people might be a bit like, oh, I don't know if that's my thing. That might be for some other people over there. So I completely agree with everything you're saying about community and culture, and I think because I think language matters, that we can broaden the language as well, so we're not accidentally excluding people. So I tried to think about how I would break this down, and if we're talking about preserving civic space, part of that is about preserving the places we have left, and the places we have left are already massively diminished. They were diminished before COVID by austerity and gentrification, and obviously they're diminished again because of COVID. So places like the Trades Club in Hebden Bridge, also a socialist working, I can't remember the exact wording they have now, a similar kind of thing, social club. They managed to raise enough money to keep going. So we need to think about the existing places, but we also need to think about how we kind of conjure up space from the end of our fingertips. There's a woman I know in New Cross, which is near where I live, who has a shed in her back garden. She has children in their 20s, and she encouraged her son and his friends to use the shed as a kind of youth club, because there's no more youth clubs really in our area. And these were young people who were on the front line of some very, you know, like extreme violence, lots of PTSD, lots of structural oppression, and yet they had the shed. So this woman basically created an amazing youth project in her back garden, and she understood why it mattered. And so places like the shed, for me, are an example of someone recognizing what surplus they have in their life or in their community and kind of opening it up. So this woman has hundreds of young people traipsing through her house to go to the shed, and tons of culture is coming out of it. It will be in the future, I imagine, like, you know, the hip hop outfit Outkast and Dungeon Family started in Rico Wade's mum's basement, because she let them use the basement, turned into a recording studio, turned into Outkast, turned into like one of the most successful and popular acts of all time. And so I think we should think about what we have around us. I think we should be asking faith leaders what they're doing with their space, because a lot of faith leaders have space. I also think we should be explaining civic space, and that's kind of what the storytelling is about, explaining why it matters so people get it. And I also think it's about reclaiming civic space. You know, civic space isn't just a kind of nice to have, it's a need to have. It's a central part of an open and free society. If you look at the definition of civic societies or civic spaces, they're covered by law. They're the places that allow us freedom of assembly, peace, freedom of expression, and where we can work out how we want to live our lives. These places are essential. They're not just kind of nice things to have on the outside. So what I would also say, just to kind of finish up, is I'm thinking about space and how we can think about it differently, because it's not just like nightclubs and bars and cafes and social clubs. It can also be the street. And I'm thinking about the city of Baltimore, which was suffering from a lot of violence. And a couple of women in the community decided to do this thing called the Baltimore ceasefire a few years ago. And the tagline in the ceasefire was, "Nobody kill anyone for 72 hours." And it's been incredibly successful. They found in February this year that gun deaths in Baltimore decreased by 52% during ceasefire weekends. But they didn't just say, "Nobody kill anyone for 72 hours. They also made the weekend a weekend where people could be in the street to have barbecues or poetry readings or legal advice, because it's kind of hard to get legal advice in a city where being a snitch might cause you to get killed. So they had to make legal advice really available to people, and they did that on street corners. So sometimes we can open up space which has been taken away from us, even if it's just like our pavements and our street corners and our kitchens. So I guess that's probably, I mean, there's loads of things I could say. But one other thing is I would recommend everyone to read a book, a novel written in 2019 called A Song for a New Day by Sarah Pinsker. She wrote it pre-pandemic, but it's set kind of 10 years after a pandemic in which congregation laws mean that it's still illegal to meet in groups of more than 30, and live gigs are banned, and music has been taken over by a kind of Amazon type company which runs all the live streaming and has a vested interest in shutting down grassroots culture. So for me, it's a really good, very prescient example of some of the ways in which corporations will naturally come in and try and give us back the culture that we want and need, in this, when we do have the chance to still kind of sit into our spaces and request them back and take hold of them and ensure that we stay connected to grassroots culture at a moment when corporations will inevitably be flying in and trying to give us what we need as humans, which is culture and community and belonging. Oh, it's, yeah, I'll put it in the chat. There you go, that's me.
Emma, nice one, that was class. Definitely taking away that it's do it yourselves, not do it yourself. And the story about Baltimore, so good as like community safety from freeing up communities to express themselves culturally rather than them being hemmed in all the time. That was quality. So we're going to move on just quickly. Please keep posting your questions in the chat. We're going to go to a Q&A like after our third and final speaker, who is Sakib, who is a youth worker, educator, and facilitator. Their work is anti-racist, queer, and centres self-determination for marginalised groups. Sakib is also a member of the UVW, shout out. Sakib was one of the founders of Workshop 44 community space in Haggerston. So, hi Sakib, are you there? And do you have the capabilities to unmute?
Yeah, I do. Hello.
Okay, great. Hi. So yeah, just quickly, like, how did you set up Workshop 44, and what obstacles did you face to sustain it?
Oh, they're really big questions, aren't they, Hans? I'm just gonna like talk about. Oh, sorry, hello everyone. I'm Sakib. I'm a bit tired, guys. I've got an iron brew and some chocolate, so I might just pause and snack every so often. How did it start? If anybody's familiar with like London Fields area, between Haggerston and Broadway Market, there's some housing estates. And when I was a young, needy person at 23, I was sent there by the Job Centre. So I was a young person for a charity that existed in this kind of rough and ready space that was full of social enterprises and organisations that had somewhat charitable objectives, if not questionable. I then went off and did some stuff. Did some youth work, worked in schools doing sex and relationships education with some young people. I did a lot of work with a masculinities charity, working with young men in schools to talk about why they're trash. And then when I came back to the space, it was, I guess I was like freelancing from there a bit. And by the time I'd arrived, most of the charities that were there had left or had moved on to bigger spaces, and there was maybe two charities that were still there, and one of them was the ones I was a young person with a few years ago, and this like small, very, very one or two people community organization. And as this charity was like winding down, they knew that I did youth work and was into community work, and kind of gave me some money to run some stuff. It sounds much more exciting than it actually was. I think I started to run, or maybe I could describe the nature of the, I'm getting really distracted by the question, so I'm just going to turn the chat bar off. The nature of the space was like that very fine line between like helpful activists and white crusties. And so there was like once a week people would do like community lunches outside where we'd all cook together and be really like really healthy and like rye bread and dals and shit. And then I think as people would pass, sometimes they'd join in the lunches and the dinners. And I think with some funding, we started to do maybe a more structured intervention around community lunches. And we'd, having spent some time on the estate, you kind of get to know people, and you'd invite somebody and they'd invite somebody. And it grew organically. At some point, I've got like a list of stuff I've written, and I really do not remember the chronological order of all this stuff. So I hope that's okay. The people that came to the lunches were people who were not working, were either disabled or on benefits and were unable to find work. I expect the kind of people who some of our parents might call them like scroungers. I liked them. They were not scroungers. They had just had difficult lives. There were no young people involved in the lunches at this point. The charity that existed there, its objective was mostly around environmental justice via community and youth work. So that's why it made sense to give me some money to do some stuff. That community lunch once a week like sustained itself, and it got bigger and bigger. And it went from the first like 6 months of it was me and one other person cooking every day for like 20 people, and it was exhausting. And then it kind of passed into people around the estate picking up bits of the cooking or bringing dishes, and it turned into like a super multicultural affair. I'm telling the story really badly. Sam, am I doing okay? Can you just give me a thumbs up every so often just for some encouragement, please? Thank you. So that's happening. I think at one point I was inside this space, and if you can imagine what it's like, there's always people on this, there's always teenagers doing stuff. There's some roadmen on bikes, and there's like, you know, some girl screaming about something and you don't know what she's saying because it's unintelligible. I think at one point we learned very quickly that somebody has had their phone stolen from them, and it's being blackmailed to perform sexual acts on someone to receive the phone back. And I was like, cool, youth worker mode, kick in. I did all the bits, did all the proper bits. And then I think that was the first time I had interactions with the young people on the estate in that way. And it kind of turned into like, once I made friends with them on that day, they kind of didn't stop coming back. And then that kind of turned into a youth club. And I say this like it kind of just, I went along with everything that happened, and it's because there wasn't any like sense of planning or direction. It was very like firefighting. Everything that we did was responsive to the community's needs, which is incredibly difficult to get ahead of, because something new always comes up. My notes don't make sense anymore, so I'm just going to talk. At one point we got some funding from the National Lottery to do one of those big lunch things, which was really nice and turned into a rave and got shut down by the police, obviously, because that's what happened when Black people have fun. The young people who were kind of like around, who were experiencing some difficult stuff, they would come and speak to me sometimes, but they wouldn't necessarily engage in a meaningful way. So I kind of like coaxed them in with some kind of like tantalizing film project. I was like, oh, hey guys, you're not doing anything this summer. Do you guys want to like maybe make a film together? I know some cool people. And I dropped some names, because my friend worked for a magazine, and they were like, oh yeah, cool. And then I think one week there was like 4 kids, and next week there were like 12 kids, and then the next week there were 30 kids, because the idea that we were making this film was like the most exciting shit to them, which is cool, but also it was not very exciting. But it's fun what 14-year-olds believe, right? They're very gullible. We didn't produce the film at the end. The film is like sat on my hard drive. It's like 50 gigabytes of footage. If anybody wants to help me edit it, email me. But it did serve its purpose of building the foundations for us to have really meaningful relationships and do some of that youth work. So although the project stuff lasted like a summer, the kids would always come back. And so then what we'd done is we'd established like a space that young people had ownership over. Does that make sense? I feel like I said that twice and both of them are wrong, but you get what I'm saying. Oh, Sam, I'm lost. Ask me another question.
You've talked about like the obstacles on the way. It just sounds like kind of constant obstacles of like firefighting constantly. Did you have a vision for where you wanted it to go? And then as that kind of developed, what meant that Workshop 44 could not sustain itself in the end?
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I guess the overall idea of it was that we were trying to build or develop an infrastructure that we could bring community members into and then kind of step away from. So kind of build like a box of self-sustaining community space and like support people to learn how to run a session or how to like organize stuff, or who to speak to at councils. And it's not like we knew this stuff, none of us were experts, but I guess maybe there's something powerful about collaborating that empowers people to do that. And I think I wrote down something about language, and I feel like somebody had said something about language before, which was quite nice to hear. I guess when we said stuff like to the community, this is your space, this is a space for you, you should be able to do whatever you want here. I think they kind of heard that, but didn't hear all of the work that comes underneath that. Like they heard the title, but didn't read the essay. And so then they just wanted to like do raves. And I was like, this is all cool, but also you're gonna get shut down. People wanted to like, it was just a very complicated space. Some of the adults were upset because we put a lot of time and effort into developing the youth club. And so they said, but it's our community space. Why do the teenagers get all the time? And I was like, can you hear yourselves? But by all means, make it about you. Barriers. The barriers are really complicated to talk about. They're like class and race was a really big thing. Most of our young people, weren't all people of color, but there were a lot of people of color. Predominantly, we had lots of young women come and use the space. And they were often, am I allowed to say this? I'm being recorded. Yeah, I don't really care. They were kind of high a lot. They were stoned a lot. And I was like chill with that as long as they weren't doing it in this space. So I'd be like, come go smoke around the corner. I'll just make you a tea for when you're ready. So then they'd come in and they'd like chill. But what outsiders saw of that was like us enabling drug usage in an estate, and us like encouraging shouting or selling, which I found confusing because for many reasons, as opposed to people taking a step back and understanding that I feel like wouldn't we all rather this 14-year-old who's going to take drugs whether we like it or not, do it somewhere safe where I can feed her afterwards and she's warm, rather than doing it in a corner and then potentially getting whatever, when there's already stories of sexual exploitation and sexual violence happening on the estate. It's like, how does this not just make sense? Yes, thank you, Sarah Bradley, for the term harm reduction. I would have said that if I was more awake. I have quite a long list of boundaries and things, not boundaries, sorry, barriers and things that others should be aware of. And I'm just going to read them off and then talk about each one, maybe if it's important. Things that people should be aware of when doing something like this is knowing how to navigate local authorities. They're mad. It feels like EastEnders come to life. If anybody's ever been to a TRA meeting or a TMO, which is like a Tenants and Residents Association meeting, people only go to that shit when they're mad about something. And so when people vote on stuff, the vote isn't really accurate about what the community is experiencing, because it's only like the angry white people that go to those things, who are like, oh, there's too many black people gathering, it's scary. It's helpful to understand council bureaucracy or have an insider in the council who's on side. I think when I was like 24, 25 when I was doing this, and it was, I would like rock up to Hackney Council just like in some short shorts and fight this guy in a suit. And I think at one point he asked me why I was doing it and I wasn't getting paid. And I was like, why aren't you doing it when you could get paid? I don't understand why it's a question. Like imagine actually caring for the people that you're supposed to care for. Groundbreaking. I think councils have a tendency to want to eradicate like self-organized spaces. For some reason, they're a threat. But like I say, if it was a bunch of white people, I'm pretty sure it would have been fine. Things that people should be aware of, that people who run TRAs are interesting, that they're usually like small-dicked men who like abusing power. And there's, oh, sorry, was I supposed to be professional? I feel like people are laughing and I'm trying really hard just to be honest, and I'm going to keep going. I can't hear any responses, guys. It feels like all of the people who were working against us were waiting for something to happen, waiting for something to happen to use to shut us down. And I think at some stage, how we lost the space is interesting, and I'll kind of go into it in a minute, but I think the catalyst for us losing the space was last straw, camel, one of those sayings. There's a sense of like us enabling young people to take drugs on the estate rather than like harm reduction, and thus they thought we were inviting gang behavior and gang culture onto the estate, which was also a misconception. And so I think one day when we weren't there, we heard a story of one of our young men. I think the story was that he got stabbed, which wasn't actually the case. He was running away from some police and actually fell on his own blade, and he's fine. But that, for some reason, was like the catalyst for the TRA to contact the council, and the council like shut us down immediately pending an investigation. So as we were shut down, we also negotiated the council to like do up the space, like give us doors that actually worked and a toilet that flushed and a new floor and some new lights and stuff, and they go in and do all the work, and they change the locks, and they don't give us new keys, and they stop emailing us back, and that was it. And it's been sat empty since. So if you guys, I can tell you where it is. We can all go hang out outside it and break in, because there's absolutely nothing happening there. It's such a waste of space, and it's such a shame. Yeah, it's empty. Well, I think they ran like, I think they tried to run like employability shit for a while, like 1 day a week for 2 months, and then realized that nobody gave a fuck, so they stopped doing it, and now it's just shut. I've done a really bad job of explaining this, but there's a couple of things I wanted to say, which were about the young people that we were serving, which were mostly, I kind of describe them as being like in between different things. So they're not in gangs, but they're on the periphery of gangs. They're kind of not in prison, but they're not in school. They're kind of like in and out of a bit of both. A lot of our kids are excluded and in PRUs, which is a pupil referral unit. But also weren't bad kids. They just like didn't get on with the system because the systems are trash. Super high risk of CSE, which is child sexual exploitation, and people were at risk of experiencing sexual violence, but also at risk of perpetrating sexual violence. I can tell you lots and lots of stories and some other time. Sorry, I'm kind of running out of time because I feel like Sam's going to yell at me in a second. At its peak, we ran a women's group and IT support afternoon for people who didn't have access to computers or internet to do CVs and job apps and benefit support. There was a bike repair drop-in afternoon, the youth club that we ran on a Friday night. There was a Sunday school, and there was a community lunch day where we fed people really good food. I'm going to stop. Thanks, bye.
Thank you so much, Saki. That was great and really insightful. And it's really important that we don't also like rose tint these discussions, and we talk about things in a really like frank and honest way. So thank you so much, especially with things like with local authorities. I'm going to pick out, I think we've probably got time to like ask one question to each of the speakers. I know there's loads of really great questions, so I apologize that we haven't got loads of time, but if we start off with Joanna, I'm gonna ask, so I'm just gonna get the question. I'm gonna ask a question from Tanya, which is about, what is your approach to dealing with antagonisms and disagreements within the community living around the Holbeck? Do you always try to work towards consensus and try to mediate between different positions, or are there certain red lines for you that you try to stick to, which is, and then in brackets, political red lines or otherwise?
That's a big question. We've sort of picking up on what Sakib was just sort of saying. It's often the unhappiest people that shout the loudest in those environments, and you have to make sure that you're paying attention to the whole community, and for us that's not just the people who are members of the Holbeck, that's people who live around the area but haven't engaged with us yet, that we've not managed to encourage into the building or into the car park for a performance or a community event. That space belongs to them as well. And so as soon as we moved in, we made a really simple booking form, which basically is the space is available on pay-what-you-decide basis to whomever wants to use it for a private function, a gathering, a meeting. And so as much as possible, we say yes to anyone who wants to come in and make use of the space. But in doing that, the people who are coming in and using the space can't turn around and prevent other people from doing the same. So a lot of people are resistant to change. A lot of them are nervous about other. I mean, there have been some issues that we've had to deal with separately around sexism and racism, and those are where we sort of absolutely don't tolerate any of that sort of behaviour. Anything that excludes or allows people to prevent others from joining in or taking part, that for us is not permitted. And sometimes it does mean that we have to stand in the middle of a couple of communities, basically holding them both in the space. And other events are much more I don't know, allow those groups of people to react, sort of come together in a sort of a softer way. But we hold meetings in the space for opinions that are different to our own. There are communities who there's quite a lot of friction, and it does feel like we're often right on the edge of the culture war here. And so as much as possible, it's about saying yes without allowing other people to say no. Mm-hmm. I feel like I rambled that on a bit.
No, that was great. Thank you, Joanna. I might also just ask you one more question, because Lou has also asked quite a practical one. I think it's also important that we allow space for these kind of questions. And it was actually around, I think probably one of the dilemmas around these kind of community projects is obviously around funding. And Lou's kind of asking a specific question about kind of work at your day rate and wanting to create like a non-hierarchical space and paying artists equally, but also that actually that might differ to sort of ACE and other kind of unions' day rates. So have you got any kind of like practical kind of I suppose responses to kind of, or like how do you kind of talk about day rates within the structure? And
so we have a day rate. Our current day rate is £110 a day. Which is in line with the current sort of union rates. And then when it comes to the sort of projects themselves, where it's a sort of a fee, it's a conversation with the artists that we're working with. For example, with the Cultural Community College, we talk to the people who will be leading those sessions and those courses and say basically it's £110 a day, so take that for your session, but also tell us how many workshop days you need. So they basically set their own fee in the planning stage, and so that we have quite a sort of an honest conversation about what that might mean for everyone.
Cool, thanks, Joanna. Cool, okay, if we ask a question for Emma, there's one in the chat that says, so Total Refreshment Centre was also a space for experimental culture, for a kind of music that might be considered niche or marginal, partly because of its form. Do you think that there might be a tension now between the very expansive idea of culture as for everyone, which is connected to seeing culture spaces as civic that you were talking about and open to all, in a context where public space is increasingly being crushed and minimalised, and then contrasted with the need to also allow spaces for cultures that are actively experimental, weird, niche, unpopular, strange? Does that make sense? So kind of that, what's the kind of tension there, and maybe what's the language we might use to kind of like overcome that, I suppose, is kind of the question as well, asking.
I think it's always good to ask yourselves when you're thinking about a space, about who is being made welcome, but also who is being excluded invisibly. I feel like the future was already more low resource and more local pre-pandemic, but that the pandemic has amplified that. And so ideally, we will find spaces locally in a low resource way that allow us to do like weird ass experimental stuff, but also allow people to do things that are maybe more mainstream, like a community pub or a women's institute, or things that we think of as being not necessarily part of what we might call DIY culture, but allow people to gather and ideally allow people to meet each other across age, gender, ethnicity, faith backgrounds, demographic backgrounds, allow us to kind of meet each other and get to know each other. I think that's really important. The only other thing I'd add on that is, I thought this kind of connects to one of the sections you chose from Make Some Space for the Reading Group, which talks about kind of middle class people as gentrifiers, or as Grayson Perry calls it, the shock troops of gentrification. And I've been, I think it's really important that we recognise that we talk a lot about integration in society, and we expect certain people to integrate. This is like a big kind of narrative in the country at the moment. People should integrate, but we never ask middle class people to integrate into the communities that they join, never. And I feel like middle class people, particularly, you know, like right thinking, particularly white middle class people, need to take that upon themselves. A question of integration. Who am I joining? What is the culture I'm becoming part of? How must I integrate? What language must I learn? What rules must I learn? And to integrate like we expect communities of colour to integrate. And so I think that's a really important thing, because that's fundamental and foundational, and places will work better if well-meaning middle class people understand that they're middle class and that they must integrate if they want it to work. One more very quick thing, just to say, I put it in the chat, but I want to offer like a discounted price of the pamphlet to anyone who's in the room today who wants to buy Document Your Culture, because I've charged it at £8, which I think is quite a lot. So if anyone wants to buy it for a £5, then just DM me. I'm easy to find on the internet, or you could, you know, like you can put people towards me. And if you have any youth groups who might want a couple of free print copies and multiple copies of the audiobook, then those are on offer as well.
That's really kind. Thank you so much, Emma. That was really great. Cool. Okay, I've got one or two more questions just for Saqib. Well, the first one, let's go with Alex's question, which is, how do you address issues of marginalised and over-policed communities where drug use and violence could either be prevalent or seen as a problem by authorities, preventing community spaces from being set up and run? And how can this be countered?
I mean, yeah, I saw that question come in. I was hoping you picked the other one. How am I supposed to know that?
I was also going to ask the other one as well, but we could, which I think was from, we were also going to ask one from Nick, which is about.
I mean, I should have just been smart and like thought about my answer while I was writing. I was listening.
Shall I ask the second one and then we can go back?
No, I like it. Let's do it. Let's work through it. How do you address the issues of marginalised, over-policed communities where drug use violence can either be prevalent or seen as a problem by authorities, preventing community spaces from being set up and run? How can this be countered? Oh, I feel like my response to that is like dismantling the systems, because it's like if you can't stop kids from doing what they want, or young people from doing what they want, or marginalized communities using the very few tools that they have to do what they need to do, and say the space is for them and ask them to change. So it's almost, yeah, just, I was going to say something bad and I saw I was recording. Okay, so I'm not going to say that. Yeah, I mean, I was about to say something like a holistic approach, like a multi-service approach, but also that's bullshit, because like 3 different services from Hackney Council came down and said, we've never seen something like this. We don't know what to do. We're going to go away and write a bespoke plan. And they ghosted us. They just didn't get back to us because they couldn't come up with a plan. And I was like, what are you getting paid 60k a year for, hon? Absolutely nothing. So I feel like that's like an electoral issue. Like, I don't know about Philip Glanville, but he can go. Nick's other question, what are your plans for taking things forward? What's your direction after these experiences, especially with the suits? I reckon I can get another meeting. I think what I don't have is the drive to do it by myself. I feel like that's what's missing. I feel like that's what was one of the more challenging things back then, is nobody wanted to do important work for free or very, very little money. And so the people who did want to do it were also the ones who were maybe most vulnerable to the societal stuff that exists in those spaces. So I mean, at one point I had to stand behind a kitchen counter and just be quiet while somebody was like going on quite a violent homophobic tirade for 3 hours with a knife, and I just had to like look down like you would when you're like encountering a wild animal, just like avoid eye contact and hope you're safe. And So it's like, yeah, I think it would need people who were committed to making the change and kind of putting themselves as the buffer between the vulnerable people and the potentially like damaging people. What are my plans for taking it forward? So I'm not working for free anymore. I stopped doing that when I was 25. So it was a beautiful thing while it lasted, and I still walk around London Fields and I still see the community members, and I'll still go to their houses for dinner. Well, not now because it's COVID, but like drinks and stuff. And the relationships are still there and they're really beautiful, and I still find ways to support the young people at a distance. But the space in itself, if we ever do something again, it won't be. I see it working in a different way. I see it working like I run the youth club and maybe the community lunch, and somebody else does the admin of the space and the fighting of the white people.
Yes,
absolutely fair. Cool, thank you everyone. We were going to have a screen break, but we are running a little bit behind. Is everyone okay to kind of go into breakout rooms straight away, or would you like a kind of couple minute break? What's everyone saying? Should we go? Okay, well, I think we'll go straight ahead if that's all right, because we'll be finishing in about half an hour. Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to run, because we have a few rules to just make sure that everyone is contributing fairly. So I'm just going to read out a few things that we just want people to be aware of when they're in the breakout rooms. So if you can change your pronouns on your screen name and put any unions you're part of, that would be great. You can do that by like renaming yourself. And if you can't, just introduce yourself when you speak in the groups. Please, we've got like a few simple and effective guidelines for your discussion, which is mainly around, please do listen more than you can talk, and be aware of how much you're talking, and make sure that others have a chance to speak. Take responsibility for each other's safety and only share what you're comfortable with. Assume the goodwill of other participants, even if someone is saying something you would disagree with. Assume that they're doing that with their best interests of the movement at heart, and disagree with kindness and respect, and of course call out bigotry, and as this is a pluralist space, and we encourage comradely debate, but bigotry will be challenged. If someone can take the initiative to facilitate the discussion, that'd be fantastic. I know a lot of people here have already been in these kind of sessions before, so that would be great, and that just allows us to kind of have get the most out of the discussion. And then I think Enyi's going to introduce the questions that we want you to kind of think about in your group.
Yeah, and we will definitely be challenging bigotry for sure.
Yes.
The first thing we're going to do in our breakout rooms is introduce ourselves and tell the group about like a community space that inspires you or you have a personal connection to, which I think is like, when we started talking about that bit, I started struggling because neoliberalism has like smothered my brain and my dreams. So I was like confused as to what I could name, but I thought I came up with like the Roundhouse, because under 25s get free workshops and free use of the equipment. But also I started a chess club with my with the music shop, which was mostly like black and brown kids, which was pretty cool. Anyway, that's just me. First breakout room question. What does it take to create a space that builds a mutually supportive community? Second one, what does it take to maintain it?
Okay, welcome back. Thank you everyone for coming back. Hopefully, so we won't really have enough time for feedback from everyone, unfortunately, but I'd be really keen to hear from something from your group, if you've got something you're burning to say and to share with us for about a minute max really, and anyone else who wants to add some comments and some thoughts, please message in the chat or use the TWT forum chat, which there's like a dedicated space on the community forum on TWT, which Sam has just posted in the chat. Does anyone have anything that really inspired them in their chat, or a thought that somebody shared that they hadn't had before, burning to share? Anyone? Okay, All right, well, we can move on then. If nobody has anything they're burning, I'm sure somebody's got something. Yeah, Sam's got something.
Yeah, go on then. There was just a thing that came up quite a few times from different people, just saying about, about how simple lots of these things are, and that you just need kind of practical solutions. Like Craig was mentioning about Slung Low and the work that they've been doing over the past few years, and just like turning up in order to get the trust of the community. And Lila was talking about the food bank that she's been a part of for years, that has both tries to solve a kind of very real problem in the community via the food bank, but then also they've got a WhatsApp group where they go off and like go to the cinema or go to the theatre and stuff like that, so that places where you're trying to solve a very like a horrible problem, but then can also produce community out of that as well.
Fab. Anyone else? Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I'd just say one of the interesting things that came out, or reflections, I believe, was from Tracy, and it was really useful. Saying about that things need to be mutual. It can't just be a case of like, this art is being put on for you and to enjoy you, and if you don't come along, it's fine because we already have people who'll come to it. There has to be some kind of process of exchange to happen as a way of kind of like building trust. So I'll just say that.
Oh, fab. All right, I'll leave you the one thought that came from our group that Saqib mentioned, that is food, that you can use food as a really good trick to unite people around the food, so it doesn't center a person. It's a way we share culture, and you know, who doesn't want free food? So that was a really lovely thought that came up in our group. All right, anyone else? Last call? All right.
Cool. A massive thank you to everyone for coming along. I've personally learned so much about something that I, in retrospect, didn't know was so effective to me, and how I could be effective to others in the future. So thank you so much for that. And to our team of organisers, Sarah, Alex, Sam, Elle, and me, thank you very much, me. And thank you to the World Transformed for hosting this session. We are a Good Night Out Theatre Workers Reading Group, and our next meeting will be on October the 11th. We're almost certainly going to do another session about anti-racism, but do get in touch if you have any other ideas.
If you'd like to shout out any upcoming events or actions, please do so in the chat. As has already been pointed out, there's a community forum as well for this session in particular. So if there's some people you spoke to who had really great points and you want to continue the conversations, maybe consider using that forum as well, because that's sort of like a place this can kind of carry on. I just wanted to shout out PCS, the union, are currently, at least in Tate, are currently on strike, which you may have heard about. So if you can please consider donating to their strike fund. It's their 25th day of strike to fight mass redundancies. I think it's something like 313 at the Tate, but it's almost certainly going across the other kind of institutions as well. Link is now in the chat. If you can donate to that, it'd be very much appreciated.
Amazing, thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, so we're on Twitter, on Instagram. I'll post a load of links just above. Also, yeah, like we said, this session was hosted by The World Transformed. If you want to carry on any of those conversations, then yeah, please head to the community forum, which I'm just posting in the chat right now. And yeah, hopefully you registered for this session via TWT. So there's loads and loads of other like amazing programming on for the rest of September. So go to the World Transformed website, go and search World Transformed and check out like the program for the rest of the month. Also, some other stuff that we did the other week. We did this Arts and Culture Day of Strategy, like was mentioned at the very start. So go and check out some of the links for that. One of the things that we did was we mapped out the arts and culture union landscape, and we made a little video that an artist, Siddhi Gupta, helped us with contributions from loads of different unions in the arts and culture sector. So hopefully that will be a kind of valuable resource. And then lastly, if you want to help the work that the World Transformed does throughout the rest of the year, not just in September when the festival is, then you can support at theworldtransformed.org/support.
View the full TWT20 programme and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.